On the 5th of September, 1755, British soldiers marched every man and boy in Grand-Pré into the church of Saint Charles de Mines and locked the doors behind them. A colonel named John Winslow stood at the front and read an order aloud. Their lands were forfeit. Their livestock, their homes, everything they had built was forfeit. They would be loaded onto ships and scattered family by family across the Atlantic world, sent to colonies that had not asked for them and did not want them. Those men walked out of that church carrying a story about who they were: French. Purely, stubbornly French. A people preserved against everything an empire could do to them. Their descendants carried that same story 1,000 miles south into the swamps and prairies of Louisiana, and they told it for 270 years. It was not the story their blood had been carrying. The name of the place was Grand-Pré, the Great Meadow. The grass ran flat toward a basin where the tides of the Bay of Fundy pull the sea back roughly 12 meters twice a day, exposing a floor of dark mud and scattered stone that stretches all the way to the horizon. Stand there at low tide and the silence is close to unbearable. It feels like the earth is holding its breath. The people who settled that ground did something that should not have been possible. They held the ocean itself at a distance. They built earthen dikes and fitted them with wooden sluices called aboiteaux, one-way gates that let fresh rainwater drain out to the sea and slam shut against the salt tide trying to come back in. It took generations to perfect. 70 years of labor, soil reclaimed inch by inch from water that had owned it since the last ice age. And on that reclaimed ground they built an ordinary life, which is the whole point. They raised wheat and oats. They kept herds of cattle and sheep. They married their neighbors' children. They baptized their babies in a small wooden church and buried their dead in earth they had made with their own hands. By the time the first census was taken in 1671, there were roughly 450 Acadians living in about 68 families, nearly all of them clustered around Port Royal. Nearly all of them tied to the same small handful of founding surnames. Hold on to that number, 450 people. It will matter more than anything else in this story, and it will not matter in the way you expect. Because 84 years later, the doors of that church closed, and what followed was not a single event, but a machine, running for 8 years without stopping. Roughly 11,500 Acadians were removed from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Homes were burned so there would be nothing to return to. Barns were torched, livestock was seized, and at the docks, families were divided. Husbands separated from wives, parents separated from children, loaded onto different ships, bound for different continents, with no list, no register, no method by which anyone might ever find anyone again. That was not administrative failure, that was the design. This was not a relocation, because a relocation has a destination. The Acadians were dispersed, and the dispersal itself was the instrument. Scatter a people thinly enough across a wide enough ocean, and they can never reassemble. You do not have to kill a civilization, you only have to make sure the pieces never find each other. Historians estimate that roughly a third of them died, some from disease in the holds of the ships, some from drowning when vessels went down in the Atlantic, and a great many from the sheer accumulated weight of being unwanted everywhere they washed ashore. 248 years later, in 2003, the Crown issued a royal proclamation through the Governor-General of Canada acknowledging the tragic consequences of the expulsion, including the deaths of many thousands of Acadians, a quarter of a millennium for 3 sentences. That story has been told many times. The exile, the suffering, the impossible wandering, and finally the arrival in the bayous of Louisiana. It is beautiful and it is terrible, and almost all of it is true. But it is not complete. And the part that is missing was never in a document or a poem or a family Bible. It was sitting inside the people themselves the entire time, in the 450 founders and everyone who came after, waiting for somebody to learn how to read it. Consider what it means to be scattered on purpose. Not sent somewhere, just sent. The ships went out along the eastern seaboard and unloaded their passengers into colonies that had received no warning and wanted no part of it. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Georgia, In some places, the Acadians were held as prisoners. In others, they were bound into indentured servitude. Everywhere, they were counted as mouths to feed in a season that had not planned on feeding them. Virginia refused them outright. The colony would not absorb them at all, and instead put them back on ships bound for England, where they were held in port towns and jails. People who had spent 70 years reclaiming land from the sea now sat behind stone walls in a country whose soldiers had emptied their farms. Some were sent to France, and this is the part that is hardest to sit with, because on paper it should have been a homecoming. It was not. They arrived as strangers in a country their grandparents had left a century earlier. They did not farm the way France farmed. They did not speak the way France spoke. Attempts were made to settle them in Brittany, in Poitou, on the island of Belle-Île-en-Mer off the coast of Morbihan. Most of it failed. The land was allocated, the families were placed, and within a few years they drifted or petitioned or left. Others went south into the Caribbean, to Saint-Domingue, and to Martinique, into heat and disease that killed a great many of them quickly. For 20 years this went on, 2 decades in which a people existed without a country. The mother country treated them as foreigners. The colonies treated them as a burden. No government wanted them, and no border would close behind them, and so they held on to each other, because there was nothing else in the world left to hold on to. That is the condition to keep in mind, not the expulsion, the 20 years afterward. A generation raised entirely in transit, whose entire understanding of the world was that any place you stand can be taken from you, and that the only reliable thing is the person standing beside you who speaks your language. And then, slowly, they began to find a destination, not because anyone directed them there, but because word traveled the way word travels among refugees, one letter and one rumor at a time. There was a swampy, humid, mosquito-thick territory at the mouth of the Mississippi. It was under Spanish administration by then. It was Catholic. It spoke French. And it was not asking anyone to stop being who they were. The numbers who made it are startlingly small, considering what they would eventually become. Roughly 3,000 Acadians reached the bayous and prairies west of New Orleans between 1765 and 1803. 1,600 of them arrived in a single wave in 1785, shipped directly from France after 3 decades of failed resettlement across Europe. 3,000 people. That is the entire founding population of Cajun, Louisiana, a group small enough to fit inside a single modern town, arriving at the end of 30 years of being moved around the Atlantic like freight. They were exhausted. They were depleted. Many of them had buried more family than they had living. They had been refugees for an entire generation, and they were arriving at last in a place where they could finally stop. But here is the thing that the story almost never mentions, and it changes everything that follows. The place they arrived in was not empty. It was already full. The bayous and prairies of South Louisiana were already home to the Atacapa and the Chitimacha, nations who had lived along those waterways for centuries before any European ship appeared on the horizon. They knew the channels, the seasons, the fish runs, the way water moves through a landscape that has no edges. Whatever the Acadians learned about surviving that country in the first years, they learned from people who were already there. Spanish Basque settlers had been established for decades. Canary Islanders, called Islenos, had been brought over by Spanish colonial authorities in the late 1770s, roughly 2,000 of them settling along Bayou La Fourche and in the marshes of St. Bernard Parish. German families had been farming prosperously for more than 50 years, along a stretch of the Mississippi upriver from New Orleans that everyone already called the German coast. French Creoles, born in Louisiana to French colonial parents, had been shaping the language and the culture of the region since the late 1600s. Enslaved Africans and free people of color had already transformed the food, the music, and the rhythm of daily life from the French Quarter out to the prairies. And in 1809, 10,000 refugees from the Haitian Revolution poured into New Orleans in a matter of months, roughly doubling the city's population and running a deep Caribbean current through a place that was already layered past the point of easy description. So picture 3,000 exhausted Acadians walking into that. They did not clear it. They did not replace anyone. They moved in among people who were already living there, and they stayed. They shared the crawfish and the cypress shade and the thick summer air. They borrowed techniques and words and instruments. And generation after generation, quietly and without ceremony, they married them. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it does not match the story most of us carry. The Cajun origin story, the one that gets printed on placemats and recited at festivals, runs like this. French settlers go to Canada. They build a life. The British expel them. They wander for decades. They land in Louisiana, and against impossible odds, they preserve their culture intact. The language survives. The faith survives. The music survives. An unbroken thread running from 17th century France straight through to a dance hall in Lafayette on a Saturday night. It is a story about purity, about a people who held the line. Everything in it is arranged around the idea that what makes the Cajuns remarkable is what they refuse to let go of and what they refuse to let in. And it is not that the story is a lie exactly. The endurance was real. The expulsion was real. The language did survive against genuine effort to kill it. But the shape of the story is wrong. It has the mechanism backwards. Because when the saliva samples started going into the post in the 2000s, and the results started coming back to families who thought they knew exactly what they would say, what came back was not a clean French line running back through Nova Scotia to Normandy. What came back was messier than that, older than that, stranger than that. It contained people nobody in those families had ever heard of. It contained a continent nobody expected, and in some cases it went back further and deeper than the expulsion itself, which meant the mixing had not started in Louisiana at all. The DNA tells a different story than the one on the placemat, and I want to be clear about this before we go any further. It is a more remarkable story, not a lesser one. Start with the surnames, because the surnames are the paper trail, and the paper trail was lying the whole time. Rodriguez became Rodrigue, one letter at a time, across a generation or two, until the Spanish was gone from it entirely. Romero stayed Romero, but the family spoke French, ate boudin, danced to fiddle music, and called themselves Cajun without a second thought. Nobody sat them down and asked how a Romero had come by that. The German names followed the same road. Abshire, Schexnader, Himmel, Stelly. Say them out loud in Louisiana today, and they sound like nothing but Cajun. They arrived as something else entirely, and the country absorbed them so completely that the origin dissolved inside 2 or 3 generations. The Irish came and blended in the same way. And there is a man who makes this plain better than any study ever has. Dennis McGee was one of the earliest recording artists in the Cajun fiddle tradition, a founding voice of the music, and his surname is about as Irish as a surname gets. He once told an interviewer, more or less, that he had never in his life met a McGee who did not speak French. That line is funny. It is meant to be funny, but there is something underneath it that stops me every time I think about it, because he is not making a joke about assimilation. He is telling you what the category actually was. Being Cajun was never about where your grandparents came from. It was about where you chose to stay and who chose to stay with you. The historian Carl Bressot spent a career at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette assembling the evidence for exactly that. His argument, supported now by decades of accumulated work, is that the mixing did not dilute the Cajuns. The mixing created them. They were not Acadians who preserved an identity in isolation. They were Acadians who merged with every community they encountered and built something that had not existed anywhere before. Bressot showed that the word itself became a socioeconomic label as much as an ethnic one. Poor Creoles were Cajun. German farmers who had learned French were Cajun. Spanish fishermen who married into the community were Cajun. Irish laborers who stayed and raised their children on the bayou were Cajun. Anyone who lived out in the country, ate the food, played the music, and refused to leave was eventually called Cajun by everyone around them. Nobody checked a bloodline. Nobody asked for proof. There was no proof to ask for. And if you want the hardest version of that evidence, look at the parishes. Evangeline Parish and Avoyelles Parish identify as deeply, unmistakably Cajun today. Their populations descend largely from settlers who came out of Quebec, out of Mobile, out of France itself, not from Nova Scotia, not from the exile ships, not from Grand-Pré at all. And nobody disputes that they are Cajun. Nobody has ever disputed it. The question does not even arise because the question was never the point. It was never a bloodline. It was closer to a frequency, a way of being in a particular place that anyone could tune into, provided they were willing to show up and then not leave. If this is shifting something in how you think about identity, about what it actually means to belong to a people, consider subscribing. This channel keeps following the DNA into the places where it quietly rewrites what everyone assumed they already knew. Because so far, all of this is culture. Names, food, music, choice. All of it above ground and visible in the record. What was underground was something else. When genetic testing went mainstream in the 2000s, Cajun families across South Louisiana started sending saliva into laboratories expecting a formality. French, solidly. Perhaps a trace of British picked up during the Nova Scotia years. A clean European line running back through the centuries to the fishing villages of Normandy and the ports of Poitou. Confirmation of what the family Bible already said. What came back dissolved the line. Native American ancestry appeared in families who had always considered themselves purely French. Not trace amounts, not the statistical noise that turns up in everyone's results and means nothing. Significant, repeatable markers showing up across unrelated households in the same parishes, and the roots did not lead where anyone assumed. They did not lead to the Atacapa or the Chitimacha who had shared those bayous for 200 years. They led 1,000 miles north, back to Nova Scotia, and back past the expulsion entirely. The Acadians had been intermarrying with Mi'kmaq families from the beginning. Not late, not occasionally, not after the settlement had failed, and men went looking for wives. From the first generation of permanent settlement, from the 1630s. The earliest surviving parish registers at Port Royal record marriages between French colonists and Mi'kmaq women entered in the same hand, on the same pages, as every other marriage in the colony. Surnames including Petitpas and Guedre carried that ancestry in their lines from the start. Those names would travel 1,000 miles south and 2 centuries forward and end up on mailboxes in Acadiana, sounding to everyone who read them like nothing but France. There is one man whose story carries this better than any percentage ever could. He was Cajun, born and raised in the heart of Acadiana. His surname was French. He had traced it on paper through 14 generations of meticulous genealogical records, the kind of documentation most families would envy. He knew where his ancestors had stood, decade by decade, since the 1600s. Parish registers, land grants, marriage certificates, censuses. He had done the work. He took a Y-chromosome test to confirm the paternal line he had already proven on paper. Father to father to father, back 300 years, unbroken. The result was not European. His paternal lineage belonged to a haplogroup found in indigenous North American populations. The unbroken male line stretching back more than 3 centuries, the one documented at every step by the Catholic Church and the colonial administration, was Mi'kmaq. Somewhere in the 1600s, an indigenous man married into a French family, or took a French name, or both. The record absorbed him, and every son after him, for 14 generations, was raised French, then Acadian, then Cajun, and not one of them knew what he was carrying. A French name on every baptismal record, a French name on every marriage certificate, a French name on every gravestone, every census return, every land title for 300 years. And underneath all of it, running unbroken through every single one of those men, a line that had nothing whatsoever to do with France. I keep coming back to that. 14 generations, 3 centuries, 200 years of that man's descendants telling a story about who they were, sincerely, believing it completely, defending it when the British and later the Americans tried to take it from them. An identity built so thoroughly on top of another one that the original vanished without leaving a single visible trace until a laboratory read the code and handed it back. That is not a footnote in a historical record. That is a statement about what identity actually is. That is one half of what the DNA said. The other half is harder, and it arrived first. In the 1980s, researchers at the LSU Health Sciences Center in New Orleans began studying inherited disease in Cajun populations. A geneticist named Bronya Keats started with a neurological disorder called Friedreich's ataxia, a condition that slowly strips a person of coordination and movement. What she and her colleagues found pointed at something structural underneath the illness. They found founder effects. That is the unmistakable signature of a very small starting population whose rare variants get amplified generation after generation through intermarriage. It is what you see in isolated communities. It should not have appeared in a population as open as the one described in the parish records. Cajun families carry Tay-Sachs at roughly 1 in 30, close to the rate found in Ashkenazi Jewish families, and about 10 times the general population rate. They carry elevated rates of Usher syndrome, which takes hearing and then takes sight. Friedreich's ataxia runs well above what the population size should produce, and then there is the detail that stopped me cold when I first read it. The specific Tay-Sachs mutation in Cajun families is the same mutation found in Ashkenazi Jewish families. Not a similar one, not an analogous error in the same gene, the identical fault in the identical place. Two populations on opposite sides of the Atlantic, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of entirely unrelated history carrying the same broken line of code. Researchers believe the mutation is far older than either community, and that it surfaced independently in two groups because each one passed through a severe bottleneck. A moment when the breeding population contracted so sharply that a rare variant suddenly became common. For the Cajuns, that bottleneck was the expulsion itself. Mark Batzer, a geneticist at Louisiana State University, spent more than a decade mapping the Acadian genome, tracing the trail backward from the bayous of Louisiana to the maritime provinces of Canada to the coastal villages of western France. He has been open about the limits of it, saying his team still wanted to sort out the full ancestral picture. What that work built was a map of how a few hundred settlers in a meadow by the sea became 500,000 people, and how exile reshaped every generation that followed at the molecular level. The expulsion did not only scatter a people, it compressed them. Remember the 450 at Port Royal. The 3,000 who eventually reached Louisiana carried a concentrated version of that founding code, and they had no way of knowing it. Every marriage inside the community amplified the original patterns. All of them. The harmless ones and the dangerous ones alike. A genealogist working on Cajun DNA once tried to sort his matches into a maternal side and a paternal side and found it could not be done. Every cousin was a cousin on both sides. The family trees collapsed into one tangled web, strands merging and remerging across the generations, all of it running back to a few hundred people in Nova Scotia 3 centuries ago. He counted well over 100 separate genealogical paths connecting him to a single cousin. Nobody planned this. Nobody calculated the cost. It happened because the language drew a circle, because shared faith reinforced the edge of it, and because when you have been expelled from one homeland and barely tolerated everywhere else you landed, you hold on to the people beside you with everything you have. The endogamy was not a flaw in the design. It was the price of survival. The blood those people carry when they stand on that grass at Grand-Pré is not what anyone expected. It is French and Mi'kmaq and Spanish and German and African and Irish and Canary Islander, and strands that no genealogist has managed to untangle yet. It is the genetic record of every single person who was absorbed into a community that should not have survived and somehow did, not by keeping the world out, by letting it in. 450 settlers in a meadow by the sea, an empire that expelled them, a journey that killed a third of them. And at the end of all of it, not a preserved relic of old France, not a sealed capsule of 17th century blood, but something alive and breathing and still becoming. The tides still rise and fall, the dikes still hold, the willows still bend toward the water, the people became everyone.